Charles Bukowski is one of those names that evoke strong reactions, a figure often celebrated, sometimes condemned, and almost always misunderstood. We are talking about a man whose entire life was a stark refusal of convention, a relentless pursuit of experience that he then poured onto the page with an almost brutal honesty. He was certainly not a philosopher in the traditional academic sense. We do not find systematic treatises on ethics, metaphysics, or epistemology in his work, nor did he ever craft carefully argued theories about the nature of existence. He held no university positions, participated in no formal debates, and showed little interest in the established intellectual circles of his time. His was a philosophy without a system, a set of convictions forged not in libraries or lecture halls, but in the gritty, often painful crucible of everyday life. Instead, Bukowski lived his philosophy with an uncompromising directness, writing it out across thousands of poems, hundreds of short stories, and half a dozen novels. His approach was experiential, believing that truth was found not in abstract thought, but in the immediate, raw confrontation with reality, however ugly or mundane that reality might be. For him, the act of living, with all its messiness and despair, was itself the ultimate philosophical inquiry, and his writing served as its unflinching record. Born Heinrich Karl Bukowski in Andernach, Germany, in 1920, he was brought to America as a child during his toddler years. His early life in Los Angeles was marked by poverty, an abusive father, and a severe case of acne that left him disfigured, experiences which indelibly shaped his view of the world. He later became known as the Laureate of American Lowlife, a label given to him by Time magazine, which attempted to capture his focus on the downtrodden, the alcoholics, the gamblers, and the forgotten inhabitants of society's fringes. However, this popular label barely scratches the surface of what Bukowski really was, and it risks reducing a complex, often contradictory figure to a simple caricature. While his stories do delve into the lives of the marginalized, his work offers something far deeper than mere observation. It presents a profound, if often cynical, meditation on freedom, authenticity, suffering, and the human condition itself. If you enjoy long, deep dives into lives and stories like this, feel free to like the video and subscribe for more. We will explore how his experiences created an artist who, through relentless self-exposure, uncovered universal truths about what it means to be alive. Bukowski, as we shall see, wasn't a philosopher in the traditional academic sense. He didn't construct elaborate systems of thought, publish treatises on epistemology, or engage in the meticulous deconstruction of classical texts. His intellectual arena wasn't the university lecture hall or the quiet study. It was the grimy barstool, the oppressive factory floor, the cheap motel room, and the cramped apartment shared with a succession of fleeting lovers and an ever-present bottle. He never developed systematic theories about existence, nor did he offer neat, palatable solutions to life's profound dilemmas. Instead, Bukowski lived his philosophy with a raw, almost visceral intensity, and then he poured that life, unfiltered and unembellished, onto the page. His was a philosophy hammered out in the crucible of experience, refined not through logical deduction, but through the relentless, often painful process of being. He didn't just observe the marginalized. He was one of them, intimately familiar with the sting of poverty, the monotony of meaningless labor, the hollow ache of loneliness, and the fleeting solace of intoxication. His medium wasn't formal discourse, but the gritty, confessional prose of thousands of poems, short stories, and novels. Through this relentless self-exposure, he crafted a body of work that functioned as a testament to the human spirit's remarkable resilience and its capacity for both squalor and transcendent beauty. Born Heinrich Karl Bukowski in Andernach, Germany, in 1920, his infant life was marked by the post-World War I economic chaos. Just 2 years later, he was dragged across the Atlantic to America, settling with his parents in the suburban sprawl of Los Angeles. This displacement from the old world to the new, from a potentially idyllic German childhood to a troubled American adolescence, set a tumultuous tone for the rest of his life. It was a journey into an adopted homeland that would treat him with an almost unremitting hostility. Early life was a relentless barrage of physical abuse from his father, the torment of severe acne, and the agonizing alienation he felt from his peers. This formative period, steeped in pain and rejection, would forge the cynical, resilient, and deeply empathetic voice that would later define his writing. For much of his adult life, Bukowski drifted through a succession of dead-end jobs: dishwashers, truck loaders, post-office clerks living paycheck to paycheck, often in squalor. This lifestyle, characterized by transience, heavy drinking, and an almost defiant rejection of middle-class norms, led Time magazine to famously label him the laureate of American lowlife. It was a catchy epithet, certainly, one that captured the surface elements of his existence and the characters who populated his stories: drunks, prostitutes, gamblers, petty criminals, and the perpetually down on their luck. He gave voice to the forgotten, the unglamorous, those who existed on the fringes of the American dream, far from its shimmering promise. He certainly chronicled their struggles, their small victories, and their crushing defeats with an unflinching gaze. But this label, laureate of American lowlife, barely scratches the surface of what he really was. To confine Bukowski to merely documenting the underside of society is to profoundly misunderstand the depth and universal resonance of his work. While he meticulously detailed the lives of the downtrodden, his vision extended far beyond mere reportage. He used the lens of the lowlife to examine much grander themes: the crushing weight of societal expectations, the absurdity of work, the search for meaning in a seemingly meaningless world, the raw dynamics of human relationships, and the persistent, often futile quest for freedom and authenticity. He wasn't just observing the periphery. He was using it as a stark backdrop against which to explore the core questions of existence that plague all humanity, regardless of their social standing. His characters, for all their specific circumstances, embodied universal struggles. Bukowski was, in his own brutally honest and often self-deprecating way, a chronicler of the existential predicament. He stripped away the veneer of polite society, exposing the hypocrisy, the boredom, and the quiet desperation that often simmered beneath the surface of conventional life. He saw the inherent beauty in the broken, the wisdom in the outcast, and the profound tragedy in the ordinary. His work wasn't merely about the lowlife. It was about life, stripped bare, in all its messy, glorious, and often grotesque reality. It was an unfiltered mirror held up to the human condition, reflecting back not just the grime, but also the fleeting moments of grace, the surprising resilience, and the relentless, often irrational, pursuit of connection and meaning. His creative process was intrinsically linked to this lived philosophy. Unlike many writers who might retreat to a quiet study, Bukowski often wrote amidst the chaos of his life, fueled by cheap wine and the late-night silence. He didn't agonize over every word in the way a meticulous craftsman might. Rather, his writing often burst forth in a torrent, a stream of consciousness infused with the raw energy of his experiences. This immediacy gave his prose an undeniable authenticity, a sense that you weren't just reading a story, but experiencing a life unfold. He often claimed that writing was simply getting it down, an act of channeling rather than crafting, though the subtle artistry in his deceptively simple language is undeniable. This method, born of urgency and a deep-seated need to communicate, became a hallmark of his style: direct, unpretentious, and powerful. Bukowski challenged the very notion of what a writer should be. He was no ivory tower intellectual, no cultured man of letters. He was the antithesis of the literary establishment, and they, in turn, often found him difficult to categorize or accept. His language was often crude, his themes controversial, and his characters far from heroic. Yet it was precisely this defiance, this refusal to conform to literary norms, that allowed him to forge such an original and impactful voice. He wrote for the common person, in a common tongue, about common struggles, and in doing so, he reached an audience that often felt alienated by more traditional literature. His impact was not limited to underground zines. Eventually, his work found its way into mainstream publishing, demonstrating that there was a hungry readership for his brand of brutal honesty. The authenticity he championed wasn't merely a stylistic choice, it was a core ethical imperative for him. To write anything less than the truth, as he saw it, was an act of artistic betrayal. This commitment to honesty meant he rarely pulled punches, whether describing the depths of his own despair, the hypocrisy of others, or the mundane cruelties of everyday life. This made his work polarizing for some, but deeply resonant for many more. Readers felt seen, heard, and understood in a way that conventional literature often failed to achieve. His willingness to expose his own flaws, his alcoholism, his failures, created a profound sense of connection, shattering the illusion of the perfect, untouchable author. He was, in essence, one of them, a fellow traveler navigating the same chaotic labyrinth of existence. His journey from an unknown, struggling poet to an internationally recognized, albeit controversial, literary figure is a testament to the power of that authenticity. For decades, he toiled in obscurity, sending his poems and stories to countless small presses and literary magazines, often receiving rejections. His breakthrough only came in his late 40s and early 50s, a period when many writers might have given up. This late bloom further solidified his image as an outsider, an underdog who finally got his due through sheer persistence and the undeniable force of his unique vision. It showed that integrity, even when steeped in wine and despair, could ultimately triumph over indifference. This long apprenticeship in obscurity profoundly shaped his perspective. He wasn't writing for fame or fortune, at least not initially. He was writing because he had to. It was an urgent, existential need, a way to make sense of the chaos, to articulate the inexpressible aches and fleeting joys of his existence. This lack of initial commercial success freed him from the pressures of pleasing an editor or catering to market trends. He developed his voice organically, uncorrupted by external demands, allowing it to mature into the distinct, unwavering instrument we recognize today. When success finally arrived, it did so on his own terms, allowing him to maintain that uncompromising authenticity that defined his early struggles. Bukowski's influence extends far beyond the literary world. He became a counter-cultural icon, a voice for those who felt disenfranchised by the system, a symbol of artistic integrity in a world often dominated by commercialism. His raw, confessional style inspired countless writers, musicians, and artists to embrace their own truth, no matter how unconventional or uncomfortable it might be. He proved that beauty and profound insight could be found in the gutter, that poetry wasn't confined to academic circles, and that a powerful voice could emerge from the most unlikely of places. Ultimately, to understand Charles Bukowski is to understand the interplay between the external world and the internal spirit. His life was a constant negotiation with hardship, an ongoing battle against the forces that sought to diminish or silence him. And through it all, he wrote. He wrote about the struggle, the defeat, the brief moments of transcendence, the relentless grind, and the defiant spirit that refused to be broken. His work is an invitation to look unflinchingly at the less glamorous aspects of life, not with despair, but with a kind of gritty, hard-won acceptance, even a defiant joy. It's an exploration of what it means to truly live with all the pain, ugliness, and occasional, glorious flashes of humanity that entails. This is the world we're about to dive into, a world as complex, flawed, and utterly captivating as the man himself. As we delve deeper into the life of Charles Bukowski, we find that his most defining trait, perhaps even his personal philosophy, revolved around the experience of suffering. He believed that how one responds to immense suffering, the kind that grinds down the soul, ultimately determines whether it utterly destroys a person or, paradoxically, forges them into something stronger and more aware. For him, life was not about avoiding pain but confronting it. Bukowski asserted that the true key lay in neither fleeing from pain in a frantic search for comfort, nor allowing oneself to wallow in its depths, indulging in self-pity or despair. Instead, he advocated for a direct confrontation, an unflinching gaze into the heart of discomfort. Only by facing pain head-on, he argued, could one begin to decipher its lessons, to learn what fundamental truths it had to impart about existence and about oneself. This particular path, however, demanded a singular kind of courage, a resilience that most people, by their very nature, seldom develop. This is because the majority of humanity, quite understandably, spends their lives in a continuous effort to minimize discomfort, to build walls against pain, and to seek out easy satisfactions. They are conditioned to recoil from that which hurts, thereby missing the profound, albeit harsh, wisdom that only sustained engagement with suffering can provide. Bukowski, in stark contrast, consciously chose to lean into the pain that permeated his early life and continued to dog his footsteps. He did not merely endure it, he examined it closely, meticulously dissecting each raw nerve and every moment of despair. His mission, as he saw it, was to extract whatever truth, however ugly or uncomfortable, that suffering contained. From the drudgery of dead-end jobs to the sting of rejection and the solace found in drink, he treated every harsh experience as an opportunity for brutal honesty and stark self-reflection. This unyielding approach to life, this willingness to embrace the jagged edges of existence, ultimately taught him a powerful lesson. He learned that suffering often illuminates aspects of oneself, reveals hidden strengths or flaws, and exposes fundamental realities about the human condition that one could never otherwise discover. It was through this crucible of constant, raw experience that he found his unique voice, transforming his pain not into a weapon of self-destruction, but into the very substance of his art. It was through this crucible of constant, raw experience that he found his unique voice, transforming his pain not into a weapon of self-destruction, but into the very substance of his art. This deeply personal alchemy was born from a fundamental belief that how one responds to suffering is the ultimate determinant of whether it dismantles the self or forges an unbreakable core. For Bukowski, the agony, the despair, the perpetual struggle were not impediments to a meaningful existence, but rather the very landscape upon which meaning had to be actively sought, often painfully carved out. He understood that the human spirit, when confronted with its darkest hours, stands at a stark crossroads, with one path leading to surrender and disintegration, and the other, far less trodden, leading to an almost unbearable strengthening, a profound redefinition of capacity. The critical distinction, as he saw it, lay in the manner of engagement. The prevailing human impulse is either to flee from pain, to distract oneself with ephemeral pleasures or numbing routines, or, conversely, to succumb to it, to wallow in its corrosive depths, allowing it to become an all-consuming identity. Bukowski championed a third way, a path of radical honesty and direct confrontation. The key, he posited, was neither to run from pain nor to luxuriate in its victimhood, but to face it directly, to stand before its relentless onslaught without flinching, and crucially to learn what it held, what truths it insisted on imparting. This was not a passive endurance. It was an active, almost scientific observation of the self in extremis. It meant dissecting the nature of the discomfort, tracing its origins, understanding its manifestations, and ultimately extracting its often bitter lessons. Such an approach demands a kind of courage that transcends conventional bravery, a profound internal fortitude that most people never develop precisely because they spend their lives in an elaborate, often unconscious, dance of evasion. Society, with its relentless emphasis on happiness, comfort, and the smooth operation of daily life, inadvertently cultivates this avoidance. We are taught to solve problems, to eliminate sources of distress, to patch over emotional wounds with diversions or quick fixes. The very idea of leaning into discomfort, of inviting the scrutiny of one's own anguish, runs counter to almost every instinctual and societal directive. It requires shedding the protective layers of denial, rejecting the seductive allure of victimhood, and relinquishing the illusion of control over one's emotional landscape. It means admitting vulnerability, not as a weakness to be hidden, but as a fertile ground for discovery. Bukowski chose this difficult path. He didn't just endure his pain, he actively interrogated it. He leaned into the squalor, The heartbreak, the alcoholism, the rejection, the sheer ugliness of urban existence, not out of masochism, but out of an unyielding commitment to understanding the raw, unvarnished truth of life. He didn't seek to sanitize his experiences for public consumption or even for personal comfort. Instead, he plunged into the abyss of his own suffering, examining it with the cool, discerning eye of a surgeon, unafraid to expose the throbbing wound, to trace the path of infection, to understand the precise mechanics of its pathology. This meant observing his own failings without self-pity, cataloging the cruelties of the world without succumbing to cynicism, and finding moments of stark beauty amidst the wreckage without allowing them to dilute the preceding ugliness. He found whatever truth it contained, however brutal, however unflattering, and held it up to the light, transforming it into narrative, into poetry, into the very sinew of his literary being. This radical engagement taught him that suffering often reveals things about oneself that could never be discovered in times of ease or contentment. It strips away the superficial layers of identity, the personas we construct, the comforting illusions we cling to. When everything else is taken away, when the external props of success, relationships, and societal approval crumble, what remains is the naked self. It is in this exposed state, in the crucible of absolute vulnerability, that one finds the true measure of one's resilience, the depth of one's character, and the hidden wellsprings of creativity. Pain, in this context, becomes a severe but invaluable teacher, revealing not just one's weaknesses, but more profoundly, the previously unacknowledged strengths that lie dormant beneath the veneer of ordinary life. It exposes the fundamental realities of the human condition, the inescapable fragility of existence, the universal nature of loneliness, the persistent struggle for meaning, and the often paradoxical beauty found within these very struggles. Bukowski didn't just understand this intellectually. He lived it, breathed it, and transmuted it into a body of work that continues to resonate with its brutal honesty and its unwavering commitment to the dark, rich tapestry of human experience. Charles Bukowski's notion of authenticity diverged sharply from conventional understanding, proving itself far more dangerous. True authenticity, as he lived and wrote it, demanded the unfiltered exposure of every aspect of the self, including those parts considered ugly, base, or contemptible by polite society. This was not merely about being truthful. It was about laying bare the chaotic, often unpleasant, internal landscape that most individuals meticulously hide from public view. This commitment to brutal honesty meant admitting to thoughts and feelings that could severely damage one's reputation, erode relationships, or even invite social ostracization. Bukowski revealed anxieties, petty jealousies, profound resentments, sexual obsessions, and dark impulses without apology or embellishment. His work served as an unflinching mirror to the human condition, reflecting not only his own flaws, but also the suppressed realities many people refuse to acknowledge within themselves or others. Such a profound level of honesty required a unique kind of fearlessness, a courage that few individuals truly possess. It was not the bravery of facing a physical threat, but rather the fortitude to confront and then publicly display one's own internal demons and inconsistencies. This was a direct defiance of the universal human desire for acceptance and approval, choosing instead to risk rejection for the sake of an uncompromised truth about oneself. He was unafraid of how others would judge the raw material of his existence. Bukowski's approach to authenticity also embraced paradox and contradiction within his own being, resisting any simplistic definition of character. He understood that a person is rarely one thing consistently. Instead, individuals are a messy composite of conflicting traits and impulses. This meant rejecting the societal pressure to maintain a coherent, easily understandable self, choosing instead to present himself as the multifaceted, often illogical creature he perceived himself to be. Consequently, he could manifest as both intensely cruel and unexpectedly tender, both deeply cynical about humanity and surprisingly hopeful about life's small joys. He exhibited moments of profound selfishness alongside acts of quiet generosity, sometimes within the same interaction, offering no explanation or reconciliation for these opposing forces. This willingness to exist within such stark contradictions defined his work and his life, challenging audiences to accept a more complex and unsettling vision of human nature. This willingness to exist within such stark contradictions defined his work and his life, challenging audiences to accept a more complex and unsettling vision of human nature. Yet this acceptance of internal paradox was merely one facet of a larger, far more dangerous authenticity that Bukowski practiced. Unlike the contemporary iterations of authenticity, often curated for public consumption, a selective unveiling of relatable flaws designed to foster connection, Bukowski's authenticity plunged headfirst into the genuinely ugly. It wasn't about admitting to a few endearing quirks or overcoming a past struggle for a triumphant narrative. It was about laying bare the resentments, the petty cruelties, the sexual depravities, the intellectual laziness, the self-pity, and the profound despair that many individuals experience but diligently conceal, even from themselves. This meant admitting to thoughts and feelings that, if voiced, could irrevocably damage one's reputation, shatter relationships, or even invite social ostracization. Imagine acknowledging, without apology or explanation, moments of intense hatred for a loved one, a perverse delight in another's misfortune, or a crushing apathy towards suffering that society demands we condemn. Bukowski didn't just feel these things, he wrote them down, often with stark, unflinching clarity, daring his readers to flinch. His characters, often thinly veiled versions of himself, engaged in acts and expressed sentiments that defied conventional morality and good taste. They were misogynistic, drunken, violent, and often deeply pathetic, yet their voices rang with an undeniable truth, echoing the unspoken realities festering in the subconscious of many. This level of honesty, therefore, required a kind of fearlessness that few people possessed. It demanded not just courage in the face of external criticism, but an internal fortitude to confront one's own darker impulses without flinching, without rationalizing, and without seeking redemption. It was the courage to say, "This is me in all my flawed, contradictory, often repulsive glory, and I will not pretend otherwise for your comfort or approval." This wasn't bravado, it was a profound, almost defiant vulnerability. To expose the raw, unfiltered workings of a mind that often harbored thoughts conventionally deemed shameful or monstrous was to risk being seen as precisely that, shameful and monstrous. Bukowski's fearlessness lay in his willingness to accept that judgment, to stand naked and unafraid before the world, holding up a mirror that reflected not just his own perceived ugliness, but potentially that of the reader too. His approach to authenticity, fundamentally, involved accepting paradox and contradiction within himself, not as a weakness to be overcome, but as an inherent part of the human condition. He could be both cruel and tender, both cynical and hopeful, both selfish and generous, sometimes within the same interaction, offering no explanation or reconciliation for these opposing forces. This willingness to exist within such stark contradictions defined his work and his life, challenging audiences to accept a more complex and unsettling vision of human nature. He did not attempt to smooth out these rough edges or present a coherent, easily digestible persona. Instead, he celebrated the jaggedness, the inconsistencies, the messy, illogical currents that define inner experience. For Bukowski, true authenticity was not about striving for an ideal self, but about acknowledging and expressing the multifarious, often conflicting, impulses that truly drive us. It was a rejection of the socially constructed masks we wear, the roles we play, and the narratives we craft to make ourselves palatable to others. He recognized that the human psyche is not a monolithic entity, but a tumultuous battlefield of desires, fears, virtues, and vices, often warring within the same individual, and he had the temerity to transcribe this chaotic truth onto the page. This created a unique form of literary engagement. Readers weren't invited to admire a hero or pity a victim in a conventional sense. They were confronted with a reflection of humanity stripped of its pretenses, sometimes to their discomfort, sometimes to their secret relief. The danger of Bukowski's authenticity lay in its power to dismantle the comfortable illusions people held about themselves and society. By unflinchingly portraying the petty tyrannies of daily life, the despair of the working class, the desperate search for meaning in a meaningless world, and the unvarnished reality of human relationships, he challenged prevailing narratives of progress, decency, and aspiration. His prose often lacked the refined elegance or moralizing tone of his contemporaries, opting instead for a guttural, direct language that mirrored the raw emotional landscape he explored. His writing didn't offer solutions or prescribe remedies. It simply presented what was, in all its squalor and occasional, fleeting beauty. This refusal to offer a palatable moral to his stories was itself an act of dangerous authenticity. It denied the reader the comfort of a clear interpretative framework, forcing them instead to grapple with the ambiguity and harshness of life on their own terms. There was no clear protagonist to root for, no obvious villain to despise, only humans mired in their circumstances, acting out their contradictory natures. This unvarnished realism, stripped of sentimentality, demanded a similar level of intellectual and emotional honesty from his audience. It dared them to look beyond the societal facade and acknowledge the uncomfortable truths that lay beneath, truths often mirrored in their own lives. Moreover, Bukowski's depiction of these ugly truths was often intertwined with a subversive humor that bordered on the absurd. He could find comedy in the most squalid or tragic situations, not to diminish their gravity, but to highlight the inherent absurdity of human existence itself. This dark humor served as another layer of his dangerous authenticity, as it refused to treat sacred cows with reverence. Poverty, addiction, loneliness, and failure were not merely subjects of pathos, but also sources of grim amusement, challenging the reader to laugh at things they might otherwise only mourn. This irreverence extended to all aspects of life, including art, literature, and even his own supposed genius, constantly undermining any attempts to elevate or romanticize his persona or his work. The impact of this radical honesty was profound. For some, it was liberating, a validation of their own suppressed thoughts and feelings. For others, it was repulsive, an affront to their sensibilities and their belief in humanity's inherent goodness. But few could deny its power. Bukowski wasn't just writing about the margins of society. He was writing from within them, embodying their voice, their rage, and their despair. He gave voice to the inarticulate, the forgotten, the rejected, and in doing so, he forced a confrontation with aspects of human experience that society preferred to ignore. This made his work not just controversial, but vital. It pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable subject matter for literature, expanding the very definition of realism to include the grittier, more visceral elements of life. His fearlessness extended to his writing style as well. He eschewed ornate prose and complex narrative structures, opting instead for a direct, conversational style that mirrored the spoken word. This raw, unpolished language was itself an act of authenticity, stripping away literary artifice to deliver his message with maximum impact. There was no hiding behind beautiful metaphors or convoluted plots. The words themselves were often as blunt and unapologetic as the characters and situations they described. This democratic approach to language made his work accessible yet also challenging, as it refused to beautify or intellectualize the harsh realities it depicted. Ultimately, Bukowski's dangerous authenticity was a testament to the power of self-acceptance, not in a superficial, self-help sense, but in a profound, existential manner. It was the acceptance of one's own totality, the light and the shadow, the noble and the base, the beautiful and the ugly without compromise or apology. He didn't seek to transcend his imperfections. He embraced them, integrated them into his being, and presented them to the world as an inseparable part of his truth. This willingness to inhabit and express the full spectrum of human experience, regardless of societal judgment, is what truly set him apart, cementing his legacy as a writer who dared to tell the uncomfortable truth about what it means to be human. His work remains a powerful, unsettling reminder that true authenticity is rarely pretty, often contradictory, and always, in some fundamental way, dangerous. After navigating the harsh realities of a working-class existence and the solitude of his early years, Bukowski began to crystallize his observations into a series of stark realizations about the world. He saw a profound disconnect between what society promised and what it actually delivered. His unique vantage point, often from the margins, allowed him to perceive the underlying anxieties that plagued even those who appeared to have everything. One of his earliest and most persistent observations was that financial success, far from bringing contentment, often led to increased anxiety and dissatisfaction. We are taught that accumulating wealth will solve problems and bring happiness. Yet Bukowski noticed that individuals who climbed the ladder of economic achievement frequently found themselves trapped on what some thinkers call a hedonic treadmill. They quickly adapted to new levels of luxury, then yearned for more, or became consumed by the fear of losing what they had gained. The pursuit itself became an endless, draining cycle, leaving a deep sense of unease where peace was expected. The second illusion he identified was the belief that social status and public recognition could provide lasting satisfaction. Bukowski witnessed many individuals strive desperately for admiration and acknowledgement, only to find the applause hollow. The external validation once received would inevitably fade, leaving the seeker needing another dose, another affirmation. This constant seeking of approval from outside, he concluded, was a false path to fulfillment, because true contentment, if it existed, had to be an internal state, not a reflection from others. This led him to see how often successful people became prisoners of their own carefully constructed reputations. They were forced to maintain personas, or public faces, that did not always align with their true selves or private struggles. To deviate from these roles, they believed, would mean risking everything they had built. This constant performance created an internal conflict, a schism between who they truly were and who they had to pretend to be. It was a life lived in a gilded cage, where the price of public success was often personal authenticity. Bukowski's third major insight centered on the pervasive societal narrative that competition and individual achievement were natural human drives leading to collective progress. He argued that while competition certainly existed, its glorification often masked a deeper, more destructive truth. He believed that the relentless push for individual triumph frequently led to alienation, envy, and a cutthroat mentality that eroded genuine human connection. From his perspective, the system rewarded the ruthless and the ambitious, but did little to foster empathy or shared well-being, ultimately leaving many isolated in their victories or defeats. Even after his own eventual literary success, Bukowski experienced firsthand how hollow some of these achievements could feel. The recognition and income did arrive, but they did not magically erase the fundamental questions or the inherent solitude he had always felt. Instead, he found a new set of pressures and expectations. He understood that the external markers of success, while perhaps making life easier in practical terms, did not inherently bestow meaning or resolve the deeper existential anxieties that continued to underpin his experience. He understood that the external markers of success, while perhaps making life easier in practical terms, did not inherently bestow meaning or resolve the deeper existential anxieties that continued to underpin his experience. In fact, his own late-life success only cemented what he had long observed in others. Bukowski had spent decades observing those who chased and attained what society defined as success, and his conclusions were stark. He witnessed firsthand how people who achieved significant financial success often became not happier, but more anxious and dissatisfied. The newfound wealth, rather than liberating them, seemed to tether them to a new set of worries. The fear of losing it, the pressure to maintain it, and the constant comparison to others who had more. He saw fortunes gained but souls diminished, replaced by a restless hunger for accumulation that could never be satiated. Money, he concluded, often amplified existing insecurities rather than quelling them. It purchased comfort, certainly, but it rarely bought peace, and frequently it seemed to cost them their very essence, their capacity for simple joy or genuine connection. He'd seen men meticulously build empires only to find themselves isolated within them, pacing gilded cages of their own making, their faces etched with a weariness far deeper than any poverty could inflict. The second pervasive lie, as Bukowski perceived it, was that social status and recognition would provide lasting satisfaction. For years, he had watched aspirants claw their way up various ladders, corporate, artistic, social, believing that the view from the top would be profoundly rewarding. Yet time and again, he saw that once achieved, such recognition proved to be a fleeting and often corrosive mistress. It demanded constant feeding, never offering true contentment. The applause, the accolades, the name recognition, these were temporary highs, followed by deeper lows when the spotlight inevitably shifted. He saw individuals desperately seeking validation from an external world, forever chasing the phantom of public approval, only to find it evaporate, leaving them hollower than before. The satisfaction derived from external validation was a mirage, perpetually receding as one approached it, and far from resolving inner doubts, it often exacerbated them, turning personal worth into a public referendum. He watched these successful people become trapped by their own reputations, forced to maintain personas that were often wildly divergent from their true selves. The public demanded a certain image: the confident executive, the brilliant artist, the charming socialite, and these individuals felt compelled to deliver, even at great personal cost. They became actors in their own lives, their authentic selves buried under layers of expectation and performance. The burden of this charade was immense, leading to a profound sense of alienation from their own identities. Bukowski saw through the veneer, noting the telltale signs of exhaustion in their eyes, the forced smiles, the carefully curated anecdotes designed to uphold their public myths. He understood that these personas were not just masks, but prisons, locking them into roles that stifled spontaneity, vulnerability, and genuine human connection. The fear of exposure, of being found out, became a constant, gnawing anxiety, making true intimacy or honest self-expression nearly impossible. They were admired for what they presented, not for who they truly were, and that distinction was a cruel irony for those who had sacrificed everything for acclaim. The third insidious lie was the notion that competition and individual achievement were natural human drives that inherently led to progress, fulfillment, and a better society. Bukowski had always been skeptical of this prevailing narrative, having witnessed the destructive rather than constructive outcomes of such fierce rivalry. He saw how the relentless drive to outpace, outdo, and overcome others often fostered envy, resentment, and a profound sense of isolation. Instead of a collaborative striving towards collective good, it created a dog-eat-dog world where empathy was sacrificed at the altar of personal gain. He observed that many who excelled in competitive environments did so not out of a genuine passion for their work, but from a desperate need to prove themselves, to conquer, to assert dominance. This mindset, he believed, distorted priorities, valuing victory over integrity, and often leading to moral compromises that eroded the very fabric of human decency. The achievers often became obsessed with metrics of success: sales figures, awards, titles, rather than the inherent value or joy of the work itself. This constant comparison and striving created an endless treadmill, where even the most accomplished individuals felt perpetually inadequate, looking over their shoulders at the next competitor, never truly resting in the satisfaction of their own efforts. For Bukowski, genuine progress stemmed from authentic self-expression and connection, not from the adversarial zero-sum game of competition. From his own experience of eventually achieving literary success, Bukowski learned firsthand how hollow some of these achievements could feel. The recognition and income did arrive, but they did not magically erase the fundamental questions or the inherent solitude he had always felt. Instead, he found a new set of pressures and expectations. Suddenly, the very act of writing, which had for so long been a solitary, almost sacred act of self-excavation, became entangled with deadlines, public appearances, and the opinions of critics and fans. He found himself scrutinized in ways he never anticipated, his past unearthed, his present dissected. The fame, when it arrived, often felt like an unwelcome intrusion, disrupting the quiet rhythms of his life that he had come to cherish. The income brought practical ease, allowing him to live without the grinding poverty that had defined his earlier years, but it did not fundamentally alter his inner landscape. The deeper existential anxieties that continued to underpin his experience, the impermanence of life, the absurdity of existence, the persistent loneliness remained stubbornly intact, perhaps even amplified by the contrast with his new public persona. He realized that while material security could remove certain stressors, it could not fill the spiritual void that no external accomplishment ever could. The applause felt transient, the praise often superficial, and the weight of expectation began to feel heavy. He understood that the external markers of success, while perhaps making life easier in practical terms, did not inherently bestow meaning or resolve these deeper, more fundamental questions. He had become what many aspired to be, only to find that the destination was not the paradise it was made out to be, but merely another vantage point from which to observe the same human condition, albeit with slightly better furniture. The world's validation, he concluded, was an unstable foundation for personal contentment, and ultimately a distraction from the only true work, understanding and accepting oneself, flaws and all, outside the clamor of public opinion. He saw that the struggle was not to achieve success, but to remain authentically oneself in spite of it. The roar of the crowd, he found, often drowned out the quiet voice of truth, and it required a conscious effort to keep listening to that inner murmur. He had navigated poverty and obscurity, and now he had to navigate acclaim and expectation, both proving to be different, yet equally challenging, tests of self. The grand prize was just another illusion, albeit one with better champagne. The real prize, he always knew, was the relentless, unflinching honesty with which one faced one's own existence. Bukowski's counter-narrative to the American dream wasn't one of bitterness or failure, but rather a fierce, almost brutal, pragmatism. He wasn't advocating for an embrace of destitution or a rejection of effort. Instead, he was calling for a re-evaluation of what constituted a good life, urging people to look inward rather than outward for their measure of worth. He had seen too many individuals sacrifice their authenticity, their peace, and even their sanity on the altar of societal expectations, only to find themselves utterly bereft at the supposed pinnacle of achievement. He believed that the relentless pursuit of external markers of success, money, status, recognition, competitive victory, diverted individuals from the more profound and meaningful internal work of self-discovery, creativity, and genuine human connection. His life, a meandering journey through dives, post offices, and eventually literary acclaim, served as a living testament to the idea that true richness lay not in what one acquired, but in how one lived, how one observed, and how one dared to be oneself, unflinchingly and without apology, against the grain of popular delusion. He championed a different kind of success, the success of survival with one's soul intact, of finding beauty in the mundane, and of telling one's own truth, however inconvenient or unglamorous it might be. This was a triumph of the spirit over the relentless pressures of conformity and external validation. Ultimately, Bukowski's critique of the American dream boiled down to a fundamental distrust of manufactured aspirations. He saw that many of the goals society encouraged were not genuinely liberating or fulfilling, but rather served to create an endless cycle of striving and dissatisfaction, designed to keep people engaged in a system that benefited the powerful few. He argued that the true path to a meaningful existence lay in stripping away these imposed lies, confronting the raw reality of life, and finding one's own unique way to navigate it. This meant embracing one's solitude, finding solace in simple pleasures, pursuing creative urges for their own sake, and cultivating genuine, unvarnished human connections. It was a call to authenticity, a plea to reject the glittering promises of a consumerist, status-obsessed culture, and instead forge a path dictated by one's own inner compass. His work served as a gritty, unvarnished mirror, reflecting back the often uncomfortable truth that the greatest freedom lay not in achieving what everyone else wanted, but in wanting what truly resonated with the core of one's being, even if that meant residing on the fringes, observing the grand spectacle from the cheap seats, and finding a profound richness in the refusal to participate in the charade. He knew that the hardest battle was often not against poverty or obscurity, but against the insidious whispers of an achievement-driven society telling you who and what you ought to be. His own journey was proof that defying those whispers, even if it meant a life of struggle, was the only path to genuine self-possession and an uncompromised existence. He offered no easy answers, no self-help formulas, only a radical invitation to look truth squarely in the eye, and to find one's own peculiar, messy, and ultimately human way through it all. This was not a dream to be achieved, but a life to be lived, with all its inherent grit and grace. In those formative years, as Bukowski embraced his role as a dissident, a profound and somewhat paradoxical satisfaction came to him. This was not a simple joy, but rather a deep-seated conviction born from standing firm against injustice. Yet this particular satisfaction was invariably mixed with the harsh reality of Part 10, a common shorthand referring to Article 70 of the Soviet Criminal Code, which dealt with anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. His actions, his refusal to yield, consistently brought him into direct confrontation with the state, leading to repeated arrests, trials, and incarcerations. Each period of imprisonment, though brutal, paradoxically reinforced his sense of purpose and the authenticity of his defiance. This continuous struggle solidified what could be described as an anti-intellectual stance, valuing the wisdom of the streets above all else. Bukowski developed an acute sensitivity to the practical realities of survival and resistance within a totalitarian system, a kind of knowledge that could only be forged in the crucible of direct experience. He learned to read people and situations with a raw, unfiltered perception, understanding the unspoken rules and hidden power dynamics that governed Soviet society far more intimately than any academic could. Bukowski thus maintained a lifelong suspicion of formal education and intellectual pretension. He witnessed how many highly educated individuals, particularly within the Soviet intelligentsia, either actively collaborated with the regime or remained silent, lost in abstract theories while real people suffered. For him, the grand pronouncements of official ideology and the nuanced debates of detached intellectuals often felt disconnected from the lived anguish and practical challenges faced by ordinary citizens and dissidents. This was not because he was anti-learning, quite the opposite. Bukowski believed that real wisdom came from living, from confronting moral dilemmas and physical hardships, rather than from abstract knowledge found solely in books or academic discourse. His worldview emphasized praxis, practical action, and lived experience over theoria, the realm of pure theoretical contemplation. He saw the truth in the trenches, in the shared humanity of fellow prisoners, and in the sheer will to survive and speak out. The insights gleaned from a prison cell, he argued, often held more weight and truth than those formulated in a university lecture hall. Naturally, this perspective put him significantly at odds with the established literary and academic circles, both within the Soviet Union and among some Western intellectuals. These establishments often valued academic credentials, theoretical discussions, and a certain intellectual pedigree as the ultimate markers of legitimacy and insight. Bukowski, who had been expelled from university and spent much of his youth in labor camps and psychiatric hospitals, lacked these conventional qualifications. His challenge was not just political, it was also a philosophical one, questioning the very sources of authority and truth, pointing towards a form of existential authenticity born of suffering and resistance that the detached academic world often failed to grasp. This growing divide between his lived wisdom and their theoretical understanding would shape much of his future engagements. This growing divide between his lived wisdom and their theoretical understanding would shape much of his future engagements. Indeed, Bukowski maintained a lifelong suspicion of formal education and intellectual pretension, a stance born directly from his harrowing experiences within the Soviet system. He wasn't anti-learning in the conventional sense. Rather, he believed that real wisdom came from living, from confronting reality head-on, from the raw, unvarnished truth gleaned on the streets and in the cells, rather than from libraries or lecture halls. For Bukowski, the world of academia, with its neatly categorized theories and abstract concepts, often felt detached from the visceral struggles of existence he knew so intimately. He had seen too many intellectuals parrot state dogma, or, conversely, engage in complex philosophical debates utterly disconnected from the brutal political realities faced by ordinary citizens. His own intellectual formation had occurred not through structured curricula, but through clandestine readings, intense discussions with fellow dissidents, and the crucible of interrogation rooms. He learned about power by resisting it, about justice by enduring injustice, about human nature by witnessing both its profound depths and its terrifying degradations under extreme pressure. This was the true wisdom of the streets that he championed, a pragmatism forged in the fires of dissent and survival. This perspective naturally put him at odds with the literary and academic establishment, both within the Soviet Union and later in the West. These institutions often valued academic credentials, theoretical frameworks, and stylistic finesse above all else. Bukowski, with his unadorned, direct prose and his focus on testimonial truth, often found himself an outsider. He wasn't interested in intellectual acrobatics or philosophical posturing. His concern was always the impact of ideas on human lives, the tangible consequences of ideology. He saw many self-proclaimed intellectuals as operating within a comfortable, often self-serving bubble, more concerned with their own reputations and the approval of their peers than with the hard, often unpopular truths that challenged the status quo. His work, therefore, was less about contributing to a theoretical canon and more about bearing witness, about screaming the truth from the rooftops, even if that truth was inconvenient or uncomfortable for those who preferred the elegant lie. His anti-intellectualism was, in fact, a deeply intellectual position in its own right, a critique of knowledge production that lacked ethical grounding and experiential validation. He questioned the very authority of those who claimed to speak on behalf of the oppressed, or to analyze totalitarianism from a safe distance. What could a tenured professor, with a lifetime of academic security, truly understand about the fear of arbitrary arrest, the psychological warfare of a psychiatric hospital, or the soul-crushing monotony of a labor camp? Bukowski's insights were not derived from secondary sources, but from direct engagement with the machinery of oppression, a grim expertise gained at an unimaginable cost. This applied not only to his critiques of the Soviet system, but also to his disillusionment with certain aspects of Western intellectual life. He observed a tendency among some Western academics to romanticize revolutionary movements or to offer apologia for oppressive regimes, often from a position of profound ignorance about the lived reality of those societies. He found their analyses to be not just flawed, but ethically irresponsible, failing to grasp the profound human suffering behind the political theories. He viewed such detached analysis as a dangerous luxury, a form of intellectual escapism that inadvertently aided the very systems it purported to critique. His own education had taught him skepticism of all grand narratives and an acute awareness of the gap between rhetoric and reality. He valued clarity, honesty, and courage above all academic virtues. His distrust extended to the institutions that granted truth, a seal of approval: universities, publishing houses, media outlets, particularly when he perceived them as being swayed by fashionable ideologies or political expediency rather than a rigorous pursuit of truth. He believed that the real test of a theory or an idea lay not in its internal coherence or its acceptance within academic circles, but in its ability to withstand the harsh scrutiny of lived experience, particularly the experience of those at the margins of power. This stance meant he was often an uncomfortable presence in intellectual circles, an unsettling reminder that the world of ideas had tangible, often brutal, consequences. He wasn't seeking acceptance or validation from these establishments. His validation came from the unwavering conviction that he was speaking for those who could not, carrying the torch of truth that had been forged in the darkness of the Gulag. His satisfaction, when it came, was therefore often mixed. It was the satisfaction of having survived, of having resisted, of having borne witness to the truth, even if that satisfaction came mixed with the indelible scars of Part 10, a reference he might have made to the punitive articles of the Soviet Criminal Code, or to the specific, degrading section of his life spent enduring forced treatment and hard labor. The victory was personal, existential, and deeply rooted in the suffering he had overcome, a victory far removed from the accolades and intellectual recognition sought by those he often critiqued. His authority wasn't granted. It was earned, brick by painful brick, in the very institutions designed to break him. As Bukowski entered his later years, a noticeable evolution occurred in his writing style. His prose, once characterized by its raw, sprawling energy and often verbose descriptions of a chaotic existence, began to transform. He learned to say more with fewer words, mastering a precision and economy that allowed him to cut away the superfluous and hone in on the essential truths he wished to convey. This refinement was not merely a stylistic choice. It reflected a deeper maturity, a distillation of decades of experience into a leaner, more impactful form, where every sentence carried greater weight and intention. This shift in his literary output coincided with a growing awareness of his own physical limitations. Bukowski, who had lived a life marked by excessive drinking, smoking, and street brawls, began to feel the heavy toll of his choices. The relentless wear and tear on his body taught him important lessons about adaptation and the inescapable realities of aging. He could no longer engage with the world in the same unbridled manner, frequenting the bars for endless nights or pursuing the spontaneous, often violent, encounters that fueled his early work. As his body became less reliable and his once formidable energy reserves significantly decreased, Bukowski found himself compelled to become more selective about how he spent his time and what experiences he pursued. The sheer physical demands of a previous life were now simply unsustainable. This meant choosing tranquility over tumult, quiet contemplation over boisterous confrontations, and the discipline of the writing desk over the unpredictable allure of the streets. This enforced selectivity was not a surrender but a strategic realignment, a necessary recalibration of his life force. Remarkably, this shift in focus, forced upon him by his declining health, actually improved his life in significant ways. By requiring him to concentrate on what truly mattered most, primarily his writing and his increasingly stable personal relationships, the physical constraints brought an unexpected clarity. He found a new kind of freedom in the structure and discipline, channeling his remaining energy into the creative work that defined him, allowing him to produce some of his most profound and enduring pieces during this quieter, more introspective period of his life. This newfound discipline was not merely a lifestyle adjustment, it profoundly reshaped his artistic output. His prose, once a torrent of raw emotion and unbridled experience, became more economical and precise. He learned to say more with fewer words, cutting away the superfluous, stripping his language down to its essential sinews. Every phrase, every line carried a greater weight and sharpened intensity born from the realization that his energy was finite, and therefore every word had to count. The earlier Bukowski might have luxuriated in sprawling descriptions or lengthy diatribes. The later Bukowski honed in on the core truth, delivering it with an almost surgical accuracy. This wasn't a loss of his signature voice, but rather a distillation of it, a mature refinement that amplified its power rather than diminishing it. The physical limitations that came with aging taught Bukowski important lessons about adaptation and resilience. The man who had once reveled in the chaotic, often self-destructive rhythms of skid row bars and endless boozing now found himself anchored to a more stable domestic existence. This was not a surrender, but a strategic retreat, a recalibration of his life's priorities. He adapted by creating new routines, embracing the quiet hours of the morning for writing, and finding a surprising contentment in the simple pleasures of a well-maintained home, a garden, and the companionship of his wife, Linda Lee. His resilience wasn't about fighting against his body's decline, but about finding alternative ways to thrive within its parameters, proving that true strength lay not in perpetual defiance, but in the wisdom to know when and how to change course. As his body became less reliable and his energy decreased, he was forced to become more selective about his activities, and perhaps even more crucially, about the company he kept. The endless stream of hangers-on, aspiring writers and boozing companions that had once been a constant feature of his life gradually dwindled. He no longer had the stamina for late nights in smoky bars, the patience for endless rounds of small talk, or the physical capacity for the drunken brawls that punctuated his earlier years. This forced selectivity, however, was not a deprivation, it was a liberation. By consciously culling the distractions and draining influences from his life, he created a protected space around himself, a sanctuary where his creativity could continue to flourish undisturbed. He learned the invaluable lesson of saying no, safeguarding his time and energy for what truly mattered. This selectivity, rather than narrowing his world, actually improved his life in significant and profound ways. It required him to focus intently on what mattered most, primarily his writing, which remained the immutable core of his existence, and his increasingly stable personal relationships, particularly with Linda. Their relationship provided an anchor he had never truly known, a bedrock of steady affection and mutual support that allowed him to shed some of the deep-seated anxieties and insecurities that had plagued him for decades. The chaotic, self-destructive patterns of his past began to recede, replaced by a surprising domesticity. He discovered that the greatest depth of experience wasn't always found in the gutter or at the bottom of a bottle, but in the quiet contemplation of a new day, the focused intensity of a writing session, or the simple comfort of shared silence. The emotional landscape of his later works often reflected this shift, moving from raw, visceral anger to a more nuanced weariness, a contemplative melancholy tinged with a hard-won wisdom. He wrote with the perspective of a man who had seen it all, survived much of it, and was now quietly reflecting on the fragile beauty and inherent absurdity of the human condition from a position of relative calm. His later poems and stories often explored themes of mortality, memory, and the enduring, if often challenging nature of love, demonstrating a profound evolution in his artistic and personal journey. This period of his life was marked by a deeper engagement with the internal world, a stark contrast to the outward-facing, experience-driven existence of his youth. The introspection born from physical limitation and a desire for clarity allowed him to delve into the philosophical underpinnings of his own experiences, to extract universal truths from the very specific, often gritty, details of his life. He wasn't just recounting events. He was interpreting them, imbuing them with a sense of the tragicomic and the deeply human. This transformation wasn't sudden or without struggle, but it represented a profound maturity that cemented his place as more than just a cult figure, but as a significant literary voice. He became a chronicler not just of his own life, but of the existential struggles common to all, viewed through the prism of his unique, inimitable perspective. His ability to distill complex emotions and experiences into stark, powerful prose reached its zenith during these quieter, more reflective years, proving that sometimes, the greatest leaps in understanding come when one is forced to slow down and truly observe, both the world and oneself. As his literary success began to solidify, with books finding their way into the hands of more and more readers, Charles Bukowski arrived at a crossroads. He had at last found a path to financial solvency, a commodity that had eluded him for decades. Most people in his position, having emerged from such profound and extended struggle, would seize upon this newfound stability to construct a more secure and conventionally respectable life. They might invest in property, pursue a more bourgeois existence, or cultivate social connections befitting an acclaimed author. Yet Bukowski chose a decidedly different route. He largely maintained the simple, unadorned lifestyle he had always known, living without much fanfare or material excess. He actively sidestepped most of the professional obligations that typically accompany literary renown, refusing the endless circuit of book tour, readings, and polite literary gatherings. He stood firm in his refusal to modify his raw, unfiltered persona or to dilute the confrontational honesty of his writing, remaining a permanent outsider even as he gained wider acceptance. He understood, with a stark clarity, that the kind of security offered by playing the so-called literary game demanded a significant sacrifice. This game involved conforming to expectations, sanitizing one's image, and perhaps even tailoring one's work to appeal to a broader, more palatable audience. To gain entry into the mainstream, one often had to surrender a piece of their authentic self, to dilute the very essence that had made their voice unique in the first place. Bukowski saw this compromise as an unacceptable trade for the fleeting comforts of respectability. It was this very dynamic that Bukowski observed as a pervasive pattern in society at large. He saw that most people, perhaps without fully realizing the cost, made the opposite choice. They traded their inherent freedom and their personal authenticity for the perceived security of conventional life. This was not a judgment unique to the literary world. It was a fundamental human tendency, one that he meticulously chronicled in his poetry and prose. He often noted how individuals endured jobs they did not believe in, performing tasks that felt spiritually draining simply for a paycheck. They entered into relationships that had long since lost their spark, maintaining them out of convenience or fear of solitude. They adopted lifestyles dictated by societal pressure rather than genuine desire, accumulating possessions and conforming to norms in the hope of finding a fleeting sense of belonging or approval. Bukowski saw this as a quiet capitulation, a slow death of the spirit in exchange for a semblance of peace, a compromise he himself was unwilling to make. He had seen firsthand the corrosive effect of such compromises, the way they dulled the spirit and choked the creative impulse. For Bukowski, authenticity was not merely an aesthetic choice. It was an existential necessity, a refusal to be anything but brutally honest with himself and the world. This stance became even more pronounced and perhaps more remarkable as his career unexpectedly began to flourish. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Bukowski had achieved a level of literary recognition that most struggling writers could only dream of. His work was being published by respectable presses, translated into multiple languages, and garnering a devoted international following. This newfound success offered him a clear path to a more secure and respectable lifestyle, a life far removed from the drudgery of factory jobs and post-office shifts that had defined his earlier years. He could have invested in property, perhaps a comfortable suburban home, cultivated a polished public persona, and engaged in the sophisticated networking typical of a successful author. He could have established a robust financial portfolio, secured health insurance, and enjoyed the material comforts that were the assumed rewards of such widespread acclaim. The literary establishment, while often wary of his abrasive style, was increasingly willing to embrace him, offering invitations to prestigious readings, university engagements, and literary festivals opportunities that typically led to further professional advancement and financial stability. Instead, Bukowski deliberately chose the opposite route. He continued to live simply, in modest homes that bore little resemblance to the mansions of his more conventional contemporaries. His residences, whether a small apartment in Los Angeles or a house in San Pedro, remained functional rather than ostentatious, reflecting a man more concerned with the flow of words than the accumulation of material wealth. He largely avoided most professional obligations that didn't directly align with his personal creative rhythm. He spurned the constant travel circuit of book tour, rarely engaged in the strategic cultivation of literary connections, and openly disdained the academic conferences and workshops that were the lifeblood of many writers' careers. He refused to modify his raw, uncompromising style to appease critics or chase commercial trends, doubling down on the gritty realism, explicit language, and unflinching portrayal of society's underbelly that had become his trademark. He wasn't interested in refining his edges to fit into predefined literary boxes. He was interested in carving out his own, however irregular its shape. This conscious rejection of the respectable, authorial life stemmed from a profound understanding. The security that came from playing the literary game would invariably require him to sacrifice the very essence of his creative freedom and authenticity. He recognized the subtle pressures inherent in mainstream success, the expectation to conform to market demands, to soften his critique, to present a more palatable version of himself and his art. To accept the comfort and accolades offered by the establishment meant, in his eyes, entering into another form of wage slavery, albeit one with softer chairs and better wine. It would necessitate diluting his voice, censoring his experiences, and ultimately betraying the gutter philosophy that was the bedrock of his work. He saw the path of compromise as a seductive trap, a gilded cage where the artist traded their soul for a steady income and critical praise. He understood that to embrace the superficial glitter of literary society was to risk losing the raw, vital connection to the world and the self that fueled his writing. Bukowski believed that true art sprang from an unvarnished encounter with existence, not from carefully curated public relations or polite intellectual discourse. His commitment was to the work itself, and to the unfiltered experience of life, however ugly or beautiful it might be. He saw the literary world, with its networking events, awards ceremonies, and academic posturing, as largely detached from this fundamental truth. For him, participation in such rituals was a distraction, a performance that drained energy and focus away from the solitary, often painful, act of creation. He sought to maintain a clear distance, preserving his subjective reality from the distorting lens of external validation. His refusal to play the part of the successful author was not an act of childish petulance, but a deeply considered philosophical stance, a radical insistence on retaining complete autonomy over his life and his art, come what may. He had spent decades living on the fringes, finding his truth in the margins, and he saw no reason to abandon that hard-won perspective for the sake of mainstream acceptance. This uncompromising stance extended to his personal interactions and his self-perception. He resisted the efforts of biographers and academics to neatly categorize or sanitize his image, often deliberately provoking them or offering contradictory accounts of his past. He eschewed the notion of being a spokesperson for any particular group or philosophy, insisting that his work was merely a reflection of his own chaotic, often contradictory, individual experience. He understood that once an artist becomes institutionalized, their message can be diluted, their edges softened, and their rebellious spirit co-opted. Bukowski fought fiercely against this co-optation, remaining steadfastly independent, an outsider even as he gained insider status. His loyalty was not to an institution or a literary movement, but to the messy, vibrant, and often painful truth of human existence as he perceived it. This commitment to raw authenticity was not just a theme in his writing. It was the driving principle of his life, a constant challenge to the conventional wisdom that success demanded conformity. He demonstrated, through his persistent refusal to compromise, that an artist could achieve widespread recognition without sacrificing their integrity, even if it meant navigating a path riddled with misunderstanding and scorn. He chose the discomfort of freedom over the easy embrace of capitulation, cementing his legacy not just as a writer of extraordinary power, but as a living testament to the unyielding spirit of defiance. For Charles Bukowski, alcohol was much more than a simple vice or a social habit. It served as a peculiar filter, a kind of internal chemistry for truth. He often spoke of it as a pathway to an unfiltered reality, stripping away the pretenses and polite fictions of daily life. Through the haze of drink, he believed he could access a rawer, more honest perception of the human condition and his own place within it, transforming observations into the stark, uncompromising prose for which he became known. This was his chemistry of truth, a deeply personal and unconventional method of engaging with the world. His relationship with alcohol was never static, but instead a complex, evolving dynamic throughout his life. In his earlier, more desperate years, drinking was primarily a form of self-medication, a means to dull the sharp edges of his profound suffering. However, as he matured and found a degree of recognition and stability, alcohol transitioned into a more integrated, though still challenging, part of his daily ritual. It became less about outright escape and more about maintaining a certain mental state, a constant companion to his creative output, deeply intertwined with his writing process. This consumption was never a straightforward case of either pure destructive addiction or romanticized bohemian indulgence. It was something far more intricate, a complex survival mechanism forged in hardship. For Bukowski, alcohol was a tool to navigate a world he perceived as absurd, brutal, and often unbearable. It was a shield against overwhelming sensitivity and a lever to unlock a certain kind of courage that allowed him to confront his own darkness and the darkness he saw in others. Crucially, it became a fundamental component of his developing literary persona, shaping the voice and perspective that would define his enduring work. Understanding this nuanced relationship is absolutely crucial to grasping the core of both Bukowski's philosophy and his unique approach to writing. His belief in brutal honesty, his unflinching gaze at poverty, despair, and the failings of humanity were all filtered through this unique lens. His prose, often described as raw and unvarnished, mirrored the disinhibited perspective he cultivated with drink, allowing him to bypass societal niceties and express uncomfortable truths directly, without apology or embellishment. Indeed, in his formative early years, before any glimmer of literary success, Bukowski drank primarily as an urgent escape. He sought refuge from the persistent pain of social rejection, an agonizing consequence of severe acne that marred his adolescence and adult life. He also desperately tried to numb the deep scars left by family abuse, particularly the physical violence inflicted by his father. Adding to this misery was the constant grinding pressure of economic hardship, a relentless cycle of low-wage jobs and poverty that made life feel like a continuous, unwinnable struggle. For the young Bukowski, alcohol offered a temporary, albeit fleeting, reprieve from these overwhelming pressures. However, as Bukowski matured and began to seriously pursue writing, his relationship with alcohol began to evolve, becoming far more intricate than mere self-medication. While the desperate need for reprieve never fully vanished, alcohol gradually transformed into a complex instrument, both a destructive force and, paradoxically, a perceived catalyst for truth and creative insight. This nuanced dynamic utterly defies simple categorization as either purely destructive addiction or romanticized bohemian indulgence. To understand Bukowski's philosophy and his distinctive literary approach, one must grapple with this profound, often contradictory, bond. Bukowski often spoke of an alcohol consciousness, or the chemistry of truth, that he believed alcohol unlocked. For him, sobriety was not a state of clarity, but often one of profound blindness, a societal construct that obscured the raw, brutal realities of existence. Alcohol, in his view, stripped away the polite fictions, the bourgeois pretenses, and the comforting illusions that most people used to navigate their lives. It was a chemical solvent that dissolved the veneer of civilization, revealing the desperate, lonely, and often grotesque underbelly of humanity and his own soul. He wasn't seeking obliteration for its own sake, but rather a hyper-awareness, an unfiltered perception of the world that he felt was inaccessible otherwise. Through the haze of drink, he claimed to see things with a starker, more honest clarity, the petty cruelties, the inherent absurdities, the quiet desperation lurking beneath the surface of everyday life. This was the truth he sought, often ugly and uncomfortable, mirroring the grimy, unvarnished world depicted in his stories and poems. This alcohol consciousness became inextricably linked to his writing process. It wasn't just a habit. It was, for a significant part of his life, an integral part of his creative ritual. He believed that alcohol helped him tap into a deeper wellspring of emotion and observation, allowing him to bypass intellectual filters and access a more visceral, authentic voice. His prose, famously direct, cynical, and devoid of embellishment, was often born from these liquor-soaked insights. He wrote about the drunks, the prostitutes, the losers, the working poor, the societal outcasts characters he felt were most visible, most honest, within the altered state of his own perception. Alcohol, then, was not merely a way to cope with his miserable existence, but also a deliberate, if dangerous, tool for accessing the raw material of his art and the distinctive perspective that defined his literary output. He wasn't just writing about drinking. He was often writing from within the state of being drunk, channeling its disinhibiting effects into a unique literary style. This connection to alcohol as a creative engine also meant that his drinking was never simply a weakness he struggled against. It was, for long periods, an active partner in his creative endeavors, a source of both inspiration and relentless self-destruction. The constant presence of alcohol in his life, particularly as he began to find his voice as a writer, solidified its role as a central pillar of his identity and his work. It became a lens through which he experienced and interpreted the world, and subsequently, a medium through which he expressed those interpretations to his readers. He never romanticized the addiction itself. His writings are replete with the hangovers, the blackouts, the squalor, and the physical toll. Yet he simultaneously presented it as a necessary evil, a Faustian bargain he made to access a deeper truth and create his art. The evolution of this relationship continued throughout his life. In his earlier, more obscure years, it was undoubtedly an escape from grinding poverty, social alienation, and the lingering traumas of his youth. As he gained some recognition, and his drinking became intertwined with his public persona, it also served as a barrier, a way to keep the world at arm's length, maintaining a defiant individualism against perceived societal norms. But even then, underneath the bravado and the self-destructive tendencies, lay the conviction that alcohol offered a unique gateway to understanding. This complex interplay of escape, insight, and self-inflicted harm forms the bedrock of Bukowski's worldview and provides critical context for appreciating the depth and often uncomfortable honesty of his writing. His prose did not merely describe alcohol. It was, in many ways, infused with its spirit, its bitterness, its fleeting joys, and its ultimate costs.